Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. It is currently Friday and I'm really hoping this video will go up on Sunday, which might be a little bit ambitious since this is the first clip I have filmed for it. I've been filming a lot this month and this week, but unfortunately none of the videos I've been filming for are done yet, or I'm not allowed to share them yet. Which is why I'm filming a new video, and today we are going to be following a pattern. Specifically pattern 2752 by an unnamed mail order brand for the 1940s. So this pattern consists of a play suit, which is this very modest looking romper, as well as a blouse. And I've already made a blouse following this pattern, or at least I've mostly made a blouse following this pattern. And I attempted to film that process but quickly stopped because it was clear I didn't really know what I was doing and I was explaining things really poorly. So I decided to just make that on my own time. Today I'm going to be remaking that blouse out of this jungle fabric and sharing more of the process with you since I now kind of know what I'm doing. This is a cotton fabric which I got from a new collection at Joann's. It has been pre-washed, so it is ready to be made into a wearable garment, which I'm really excited to add to my wardrobe. I've been branching out my wardrobe a lot recently and making it more vintage apparel themed, and I will probably have videos up about that at some point in the near future too, because you guys did show some interest. So I'm hoping once I make the shirt out of this, I can add it into rotation with some of the other 1940s inspired pieces I have. And for the romper, I'm going to be using this beautiful pale yellow, buttery colored cotton, which is covered in fish. Now I know what you're thinking. That is a beautiful combination of fabrics you have acquired. Such gorgeous contrast, picking up on the subtle tones. I'm kidding, of course. These obviously don't go together. The first time I followed this blouse pattern, I made it from a orange and white striped cotton sateen, and the orange and white in that really brings out the details in this pattern. So I'm intending to wear the play suit with that blouse, and then this is going to be paired with something else in the future, which I will probably also film the process of making, since that is what I do. Lighting is still okay. I'm going to cut out the shirt and show you the beginning steps of making that, and then this evening we will make the mock-up for the romper and try and tackle that. So let's go ahead and get started and get my fabric laid out. So I went ahead and got everything cut out. This is the front panel, this is the collar as well as the yoke, and this is the back panel, and this is the sleeve. You may notice that I've added a 1/2 inch of seam allowance onto the edges. That's because I'm going to sew the side seams as French seams as opposed to the 1/2 inch seams and pinked edges, which this pattern calls for. I'd really like this to be durable. I'd like to be able to throw it in the washing machine. The material will let me do that, and I would like the construction to allow me to do that too. So I'm going to be finishing this beyond what they recommend doing in the pattern instructions. So as you might notice, these pattern pieces are unmarked, though there are some 40s patterns with markings. This was very common up until the 1950s. Especially by lesser known brands that couldn't afford the printing presses to print onto the tissue. So instead, everything we need is marked with perforations. They're a little bit difficult to see, but these perforations mark the center front, these mark the button placements, and then 2 perforations near the edge of the material indicate that it needs to be cut on a fold. So you can see here and here. And then there are notches and more perforations that mark where the fabric needs to be gathered and stitched together. So it isn't too difficult to follow, it's just different to follow than a normal pattern. It instructs me to make the darts in the pieces first, so I'm going to go ahead and mark the darts on the front panel as well as the back panel and get those sewn. At the same time, I'm also going to sew the 2 collar pieces together to finish off the edges, and I'm probably also going to sew up the side seams for the sleeve. Though I'm following what they tell me to do instruction-wise, I'm not going to take it step by step since I have followed this before and I kind of know how to do it. So I'm going to mark all the perforations onto this, get the darts pinned, and then I will show you what we're working with. So I went ahead and got everything marked onto the front panels. It's always difficult figuring out what to use to mark printed materials. When I use darker solid colored fabrics, I use chalk, and when I work with lighter colored solid fabrics, and I usually use water soluble markers. And by water soluble, I mean like markers that are specifically meant to be used on fabric and to be rinsed out. This doesn't have a brand on it, but this is the one that I used, and I just got it from Joann's. It doesn't show up particularly well on this, but I did use it to mark the center front line as well as the buttonholes, which I think I'm going to have to go over with pencil later to make them look more defined. And the darts, since they are marked on the back side of the fabric, I used a pencil for them. So I pinned the darts for the other side, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process for this panel. I also pinned together the sleeves with the wrong sides facing each other, since this will be sewn as a French seam, so I'm just going to stitch a 1/2 inch away from that edge. And then I pinned together the collar. So I'm going to sew all the way around this edge using a 1/2 inch allowance to neatly finish the edges, and I might top stitch around it too, depending on how I'm feeling. So that is what I'm going to be up to, and I will report back once it's done-ish. So a little bit of progress has been made. I got the back panels ironed, and I'm going to go ahead and gather them down. So as you can see, there are the notches here, and these notches line up, and these notches line up, and I gather in between the notches, so this lower back portion fits onto the yoke. So that's what I'm going to do next. I also, unfortunately, have to recut and sew the collar because I sewed it together with the wrong sides facing each other, and I clipped the corners. It's going to be difficult to rip out my stitching and re-sew this, so I think I'm just going to recut it since I have plenty of fabric left. I also got the darts sewn into this, and you can't really see them since the pattern is so dense, which is good, and I got those ironed. And then I got the sleeves sewn together, and I trimmed the edge, and I ironed it and repinned it, so now it can be stitched as a French seam. So that is what I am up to. I'm probably going to gather this and recut this off camera and give my camera battery a few minutes to recharge, and then I will show you what we're working with. Alright, so we have quite the jungle look going on in here. I showed you the front panels in the last clip, and those are the darts in a little bit more detail. I also folded the front edge inward by a 1/2 inch and stitched it down. Eventually, this portion will be folded inward and hand stitched down. So as opposed to just ironing or basting this edge in place, I wanted it to be really securely stitched, so that'll make it more durable when it comes to washing it. I also got the back panel gathered and sewn onto the yoke, and then I covered the seam allowance with matches bias binding. So once again, this isn't going to fray when washed. Here is the newly recreated collar. I like how it came out. I think it looks very sharp, and I opted not to top stitch around it. I think I misunderstood the diagram. They weren't showing the top stitching, they were showing the initial stitching of the two pieces together from the interior. So I kind of messed up on my first attempt at this, I guess. Also, I really like how the framing turned out. You just see a little bit of this tiger peeking out over the edge, which I think is really cute. And the seams for the sleeves are done. So now I'm going to hem the sleeves. They have a 1.5 inch hem allowance, and I believe they intend for you to hand stitch the hem, but I'm going to do it by machine since this has a more utilitarian feel to it. I'm not as bothered by visible top stitching. I'm also going to sew up the side seams with a French seam, and then I will sew up the shoulder seam and bind this edge with the bias binding, which I just showed. So I just tried filming for half an hour with the servo autofocus off, so I have no idea how much of that was blurry and how much I decided to include, but that's unfortunate. So I went ahead and sewed all the seams just like I said I would. I also added binding to the ones that weren't sewn as French seams, so nothing is going to fray. I say as there are threads sticking out everywhere. I'll trim those in a minute. So the next step after sewing up the side seams and shoulder seams was folding the front portion so the right sides were facing each other and sewing up to this notch. So this is going to be part of the lapel, and this is going to turn right side out and create a nice little point. Come on. This is really difficult to do one-handed. The rest of this is going to be sewn in. Does that make any sense? Probably not. But I'm going to go ahead and turn this outward properly and pin it, and then hopefully you will get the vision of it all. So I got everything pinned and ironed, and this is what it looks like very roughly positioned on my dress form. But here you can see how nicely finished this edge is. And this flips outward and shows you another nicely finished edge. And then this edge needs to be whip stitched down, but it'll be hidden once the blouse is buttoned. So really happy with how that looks. It looks much sharper than it did on my first attempt, which is good. And those little blue spots you see are water-soluble pen, so that'll come out. Alright, so it's a little bit later on and my camera has had time to charge. I've also emptied off my memory card, so we should be good to go for the rest of the evening. So I followed their step and went ahead and sewed the collar on, and then I just bound the raw seam allowance and whip stitched it upward, so when the collar flips out, it's going to be hidden. The next thing I have to do now is sew this lapel to the collar, so when it flips out, it looks like this instead of them being separated and floppy like they are over here. So I'm going to go ahead and just sew this by hand using slip stitches, and then we can move on to sleeves and hems and buttons and all of that exciting stuff. So after tacking everything, this is what the collar looks like. I think it looks really nice and sleek, and it would look even better if it actually fit my dress form. I'm really happy with the shape of this collar, and I love this shirt so much, and I love this fabric so much, and it's nice seeing it all to come together. So now we are going to go ahead and tackle the sleeve. I did end up using some scraps to make some shoulder pads, and these are just every time I try and talk, the dog barks. And these are just squares of quilt batting that I covered and then folded in half and bound the edges of. So they give a nice little amount of lift into the shoulder, and they are washable, which is really, really nice. So they don't look super pretty since I didn't do a great job finishing them. I just used scraps, but they will definitely do the job, and they will be hidden away so you won't see them. These are the sleeves, and to fit these into the shoulder, I do have to lightly gather the top between the notches. Then we will set them into the arm side. So unfortunately my first attempt at shoulder pads are too small, and the bias binding around the edge causes too big of a lump underneath the very thin cotton shirting. So I'm making larger shoulder pads, and instead of binding the edges, I'm just zigzag stitching around them to help prevent fraying without creating that ridge. So here you can see the size difference. This is actually going to look like less volume since it's the same thickness, but it tapers off, whereas this has a little ridge around it. So hopefully these look a lot better. I still have one left to do. I'm also going to go ahead and zigzag stitch around the raw edges of the sleeves. I got these sewn on and I think they look pretty good. I did a fitting and all was well, so I just want to prevent these edges from fraying. And the reason I'm not using a bias binding instead is because I think it's going to add bulk, and using a smaller binding like lace binding is going to be a little bit scratchy. So I feel like this is the best thing to do. So I just wanted to do a little fitting with the shoulder pads before sewing them in, and these look much better. You really can't see the line where they end at all, which is exactly what you want. And these are placed so the center of them, the longest portion, are in line with the shoulder seam, and the thicker edge goes to the outer portion of the shoulder, and then it slopes inward. These are just tiny shoulder pads, so they add a little bit of structure just beyond where my shoulder actually ends, and help flare out the top of the sleeves a little bit. These don't actually straighten out the shoulder dramatically the way that some would have during this period. Alright, so these shoulder pads have been sewn in, which reminds me I really need to add shoulder pads to the bodice up there too. As you can see, I have covered shoulder pads, I just didn't get around to sewing them in. They look like this from the inside, and the front is tacked down, the back is left free to fly. So you do kind of have to arrange them over your shoulders when you're putting the shirt on, but that isn't difficult to do by any means. And you can't really see any of the stitching attaching them from the front side, which is what we want. So after doing that, I did another fitting, and we are all good. It looks great. I also did a little test for the buttonhole option on my sewing machine, and it seems to work pretty well on 2 layers of this fabric, which is how many layers there are at the front. So now I'm going to go ahead and get my buttons out, and then we can get those sewn on as well. But this means we get to pull out the button box again. You guys were very fond of this last time, and I actually organized it a little bit, so I will show it to you once again. Ta-da! I realize that I have a totally unnecessary amount of buttons, but I will say that these two guys are stacked on top of a box of buttons, which was $15, I think. And then these are all bags of buttons that were a couple dollars each. So I don't have a very expensive button collection, even though I do have quite a large quantity of buttons. And for this piece, I purchased these buttons. Though now I'm not sure if they'll match. So these don't match as perfectly as I had thought, but I do think they work well with the tones in the shirt, so I'm going to use them anyway. If I had pink buttons, I would probably be tempted to use those, but I do like the idea that the base color of this is green, and I can pair it with something that is black, or red, or gold, or all of these different colors, and I feel like using contrasting buttons would kind of limit that. So I'm going to stick with these. I also found these cute little orange ones, which I'm going to use for the blouse up there. I had originally planned on using white buttons, but these are actually the only real button option I have for the romper. So I'm going to save these for that and use these little orange ones on the other blouse instead. So now I have some buttonholes to sew, and I shall share and speed up that process with all of you. So the buttonholes have all been sewn, and hopefully they were sewn successfully, though I won't really know until I get the buttons on and see if they will go through the holes. I'm actually going to cut these open and stitch the buttons on downstairs, and then I shall be back and I shall show you what it looks like. So I finished sewing the buttons onto the shirts, and I cut open the buttonholes, and I also hemmed the jungle printed shirt, and now they are both almost done. I'd like to say that they're done, but not quite. The buttons are placed really far over, and it ends up doing kind of janky things to the collar, which is really prominent on this one. You don't notice it as much on the jungle print one since it has a much denser print, but with the stripes it's really obvious, so I think I'm going to add another button right there and make it almost double-breasted at the top, and then the collar, though still oddly situated, will be permanently situated that way instead of kind of flopping around the way it is now. But overall, I'm pretty happy with these shirts. I really like how they fit. I like how they look. I'm excited to make pieces that will go with them and to continue expanding my wardrobe and to incorporate these pieces within that. I'm also really excited to make the playsuit. So it is currently after 9 o'clock, and I usually start turning my brain off around 10, so I don't think I'm in any position to follow their assembly instructions tonight, but I would like to get this cut out, and then I'll have a head start on the mock-up making process tomorrow. I don't think anything is cut out on a fold or anything, so it should be pretty... Oh, I guess this panel is. But it should be pretty self-explanatory to cut out. I'm probably going to add an extra ½ inch. I was going to say I was going to add an extra ½ inch to the hips because I know the hip measurement is smaller than mine, but the tops themselves run quite large, so I'm hoping that the culottes pattern will run large too, and because of that it will end up fitting me. So I might follow theirs exactly and be prepared to let it out when I make the final garment. So I'm going to go ahead and get some cotton laid out and get my pattern tissue laid out, and hopefully we can get this cut out as well. Also, this pattern tissue smells amazing. I know that sounds weird, but it smells like old books, which is one of my favorite smells. People talk about the new book smell, but it has nothing on old book smell. It's just like makes me think of antique stores and wonderful things. If you feel that way about old books too, then you need to tell me in the comments so I feel less weird and alone. So I got everything cut out, and I'm going to call it quits here for tonight. This might end up being the end of this video depending on how much I've filmed, and if that is the case, then thank you for watching. The video about making this romper thing is going to be up tomorrow, so definitely keep an eye out for that. And if this ends up all being one video, then I've just made myself sound really silly, haven't I? Anyway, that is it from me for today, and I'm looking forward to getting started on this tomorrow and attempting to work my way through their instructions. I will definitely be following the instructions a lot more closely. As I said, since I had made the blouse before, I knew what I was doing and I knew the various steps, and I just sort of zoomed through them without reading them, but I am going to try and follow their instructions word for word tomorrow, or at least to the best of my ability. So I shall see you then.